Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and I'm trying something a little bit different today. If you're just listening to the podcast in your favorite podcast app, whatever it is, the Apple Podcast app that's on iOS. I personally, for Android, I love to use Pocket Casts. That's my favorite podcast player on the Android side, but you also have Google Play and Spreaker and iHeartRadio app and all that good stuff. So however you're listening to the audio of this, what I'm trying new today is I'm recording video of this as I'm going. And I know a lot of longtime listeners or subscribers on YouTube already know that I do this from time to time, but I got a new camera. I picked up a Canon EOS SL3. I think it's the 900 or 200D in other countries, but in the United States of America, it is the Canon EOS Rebel EOS SL3. It is a wonderful, wonderful camera. I can actually see what I'm doing. It has a fold-out screen. It records in 4K. I'm not recording in 4K right now. 4K is limited to 24 frames a second. This is not a podcast about the camera I'm using. I'm just excited to use the camera. So when I upload content to YouTube, I've been thinking that while I do upload from time to time very, well, for me, I'm still learning as I go, polished videos. So for instance, my best performing video right now is the PSP Worth It video. Actually, I've got the PSP behind me right here. The PSP from that video. As you can tell, I am in my home studio, the podcast studio, the man cave. I will interject some footage here of what the man cave is. I've actually got my camera propped up on the arcade cabinet right now. So I'm just trying a lot of different new things, and I thought I would upload more podcasts to the YouTube channel as filler in between my dedicated videos. When I upload podcasts to YouTube, they tend, obviously, I mean, it's a small channel, they tend not to do as good as other more polished videos. But you know what, as the YouTube channel grows, this is kind of what Geek Therapy Radio is all about, talking about geeky things as they come to mind. And as my regular listeners know, the Geek Therapy Radio podcast is separate from the broadcast, and in the podcast, I get to go on wild tangents. It's way more freeform. There's less cuts and edit, and especially if I record for YouTube, there's not going to be many edits in here. It's just going to be stream of consciousness. If you haven't noticed already, I have put somewhere in the video here, if you're watching on YouTube, the time where I start what I call the meat and potatoes of the podcast. So the meat and potatoes of this podcast is going to be the future of the Nintendo Switch in terms of the new Xbox and the new PlayStation 5. How will Nintendo compete with the new offerings from Microsoft and Sony? And we'll get to that at the timestamp. Before we do, I'll mention right now, because a lot of my listeners know we're geeks, we're all geeks about something, they might find this interesting. Jeremy Benson, a friend of the show, he's been on the show many times before, walked into my studio today at work at the radio station, and he posed this question. He said he had a friend or a family member, a cousin, I forget exactly who. I think it's a family friend, who's looking into getting into audio production. He wants to run, Pro Tools first, maybe Cakewalk Sonar, maybe Albeaten or Logic, or not Logic, because that's Mac only. But getting into audio production. And the question arose was, we both know that to get into audio recording and mixing and mastering and all that good stuff, you don't need a super powerful PC. So that got me thinking, as I've moved into this new house here, I have a closet, I have this wall, I've found so many old computer parts and components, and I have a handful, 3 or 4 socket 775 Intel motherboards, a G40, I think G41 is the number on the motherboard, the model of motherboard. And that got me thinking, you know what? I have a few Core 2 quads sitting around, CPUs, socket 775 CPUs, the venerable Q6600, which is just as landmark and lasting of a processor as the first Pentium 4. Then, like I mentioned, the Q6600 have a few of those. The i5 2500K, the second generation Core i5 processors. Intel has these kind of landmark processors through the years, and the Q6600, by all means, I'm going to shadow box one of them, is one of those processors that is just... It just stands the test of time. We remember it fondly. I'm sure maybe some of you watching have fond memories of the quad-core Core 2 Duo Q6600. It was clocked at 2.4-ish megahertz. So it just got me thinking, I bet you that processor would be more than capable of doing a build around that Q6600, which you can go onto eBay, I'm sure, and get for dirt cheap right now. Maybe a lot of people have that laying around their house already. They have some old builds sitting around collecting dust, old components. Maybe you have a socket 775. The Q6600 came out in the first quarter of 2007, I believe. The motherboards I have are the G41 or P41, whatever. They're DDR3. The Q6600 operates at for the RAM, it's 1066 megahertz. I think on my computer I've got up and running, it's technically 1080 something. Anyways, that's beside the point. I proposed that you could build a quite capable audio workstation and just good all-arounder PC around the Q6600 processor from 2007. So this is really fun. This is what I've been doing. Speaking of videos, I'm working on a video right now as to whether or not you can still get by in 2020, as it's going to turn out here in a couple days. In 2020, 13 years after the Q6600 was released, can you build a computer around that processor and still do day-to-day tasks and still have it be a viable gaming PC, viable productivity PC, a viable content creation PC? Within expectations. And so bottom line is I'm working on an in-depth video about that, about the Q6600 still being valuable or still being perfectly serviceable in 2020 as far as a gaming PC and a productivity PC and even a basic content creation PC. So I gathered together my own parts, collecting dust literally, and I cleaned them all off and I built the PC that I'm recording this into right now, the audio into this right now. So that video's coming up. I don't know. I haven't edited the video yet. I'm going to see if I can edit the video in Sony Vegas 15 on this Q6600 powered PC. I'll let you know in the comments below if I was able to edit this video that you're watching right now on a 2007 quad-core processor. In this PC, just to fill out the rest of the specs, I've got 8 gigs of DDR3 RAM, clocked at the 1066 or 1080, whatever it is. The graphics card, because I didn't want the graphics to be a bottleneck of the PC. It's an older card. It's the GTX 960. That should pair very, very well to a Q6600. I'm going to toss in my GTX 980 and see if I get any extra frames out of that to make sure that to see whether or not that makes much of a difference. I'm leaning towards no, because like I said, the build I'm building here is trying to make the CPU the bottleneck. So I'm trying to put in graphics card. 960 came out in 2014, GTX 960, 2014, 2015, I believe. Several years after the Q6600 CPU. So that's the build I've got going right now. Like I said, I'll let you know in the comments if I was able to edit the video on this machine with that GTX 960 and Q6600 and 8 gigabytes of RAM. So that's a side project I've got going on right now. Okay, now this timestamp should start to disappear because here's the meat and potatoes. And if you're just listening to the podcast, I'll put the timestamp in the title too. So anyways, the Nintendo Switch, the future of the Nintendo Switch in terms of competing against the new offerings coming out in 2020 from Microsoft and Sony, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Elite X. Did I get that right? I'm having the hardest freaking time memorizing Xbox names. I don't know. Can you see it up there in the frame? Here's the first original OG Xbox up there. It's a terrible naming scheme for Microsoft, regardless. Just a terrible naming scheme. PlayStation, PS1, PS2, PS3, PS4, PS5, Microsoft. Okay, so that was silly. But yeah, Sony, get your ish together. Jeremy Benson, who I mentioned earlier, also came into the studio, and one of the subjects we got talking about was the future of the Switch in terms of the new Xbox and the new PlayStation 5 coming out. And here's what we were getting at. He said he was listening to a podcast or watched a video recently where they were discussing that they don't think that Nintendo's going to have a whole lot of third-party... I shouldn't say that. That they might not have a whole lot of ports coming to the Nintendo Switch because everything being made for the new Xbox and the new PlayStation 5 is going to be so hardware intensive that there would effectively be no way to port it to something like the Nintendo Switch that is far, far less powerful. And this just got me thinking, how true would that be? So we have the port that comes to mind on the Nintendo Switch that I'm thinking right off the top of my hat, Witcher. Of course, that's at lower frame rates than you could run on a PC for sure. Lower resolution, it's the 720p on the Nintendo Switch. I'm not sure off the top of my head if the Witcher upscales to 1080p, like truly native resolution 1080p on the Nintendo Switch. I don't have the Witcher on the Nintendo Switch. But the point remains that with this next generation of mainstream consoles, the Nintendo Switch could theoretically be left behind in terms of ports. When developers are making games for the ultra-powerful PlayStation 5, the ultra-powerful Xbox Elite X, and ultra-powerful PCs. That was the concern. Now, here's where as I started to think about it, my initial gut reaction was, well, yeah, they're going to make things so graphically intensive, so hardware intensive that there's no way the Switch could even hope to have a port of it. But then the more I thought about it, there's more issues in play here. I don't think hardware, horsepower on the Nintendo Switch is going, if anything's going to be the Achilles heel of porting these AAA titles to the Nintendo Switch. The Achilles heel of the Nintendo Switch, I believe, and this, again, assuming that they're not going to come out with a Nintendo Switch Pro in 2020, which I hope they do. I hope they call it the Super Switch or Nintendo Switch Pro. Like, Nintendo is going to offer a beefier Switch. That's my assumption there. Don't quote that as gospel, but you would think that Nintendo would, because they've had a history of doing this, the most recently with the 3DS. I have the 3DS XL right here behind me. Can you see that? The 3DS XL and the new 3DS XL, which had a slightly beefier spec, slightly beefier hardware. So there's no reason why the Switch wouldn't do the same. Nintendo did recently upgrade the Switch with the new version of Switch that has more power efficiency. But again, the Achilles heel I don't think is going to be the horsepower of the Switch. I think the Achilles heel of the Switch that Nintendo would need to sort out, at least with the new model of Switch, is the memory, specifically the internal memory. One of the side effects of the next generation of consoles, the new Xbox and the new PlayStation, is going to be that games are going to be gargantuan. Well over 100 gigs. There's games right now that are well over 100 gigs of storage. The Nintendo Switch does not come with anywhere near 100 gigs of storage. I believe, I'll put a graphic up here if I'm wrong, but I believe it ships with 32 gigs of internal memory. There was a game that came out shortly after launch. I think it was LA Noire, if I'm not mistaken. The actual name of the game isn't most critical, but the point is that to download the game, it couldn't fit on the internal memory of the Nintendo Switch. You had to get a micro SD card in order to actually download and save the game. Speaking of downloading, that's another Achilles heel we'll get to in a second. But the point is that in order to compete with the next generation of consoles and get those AAA ports to the Switch, it's not going to be about hardware and graphics horsepower. It's going to be about storage. specifically how fast the storage is and how much storage Nintendo supplies internally with the Nintendo Switch, or how much storage they officially support via micro SD card. Either way, Nintendo's going to have to sort out the internal memory, or the memory situation, storage situation on the Nintendo Switch. So that brings me to the next sort of Achilles heel. The last thing is going to be hardware. We'll talk about that, how the hardware competes with next generation consoles. But the next Achilles heel is going to be, okay, so the next generation of games, they're not going to be any smaller than the current generations of games. But we can assume that just with the progress of time, that games will just naturally get bigger and bigger in file size. The Nintendo Switch has, let's just say that their Wi-Fi or their internet connection is slow. Downloads is slow, uploads are slow. It's got a slow internet connection no matter how you connect to the internet, whether you buy a USB adapter to Ethernet adapter so that you can run straight from your modem or your router through an Ethernet cable, Cat 5, Cat 6, whatever, straight into the Switch. It is not a very fast download speed. It is incredibly slow. It's not. I think it's double digit in a decimal. I'll verify this in a minute here, but I think it's something like 30 or 40 megabits per second download, which translates to 3 or 4, maybe 5 megabytes. 4 megabyte, that'd be 432. Yeah, it's not that quick. So let's say if a next generation game comes out, it does get ported to the Switch and it's huge. Let's say it's 100 gigabytes, and let's assume you have all the storage on the Switch for it. It's going to take forever to download games that big, especially over Wi-Fi, and it's not much better with an actual hardwired Ethernet connection. Again, I'll verify that in the podcast. I'll type into the description what I found about that, and the YouTube, I'll put in the comments what I found about that. But I believe it's just double-digit decimal, so 0 point whatever, download speeds in megabits. Megabytes is single-digit megabyte download, single-digit megabyte uploads. So downloading huge games is going to be a problem. Achilles heel is going to be storage. Achilles heel is going to be that internet connection. So Nintendo has to address those two issues, internet connection and storage, especially internal storage. I'm saying if Nintendo releases, let's say, a Nintendo Switch Pro, I would say it would need, at bare minimum, built-in storage, and this is subject to your opinion on this, especially if you're on YouTube and you can easily just type your opinion on this. I'm going to say minimum for a Nintendo Switch Pro is going to be 128 gigs of internal storage. Minimum. Absolute minimum. I was going to say 256 gigabytes internal storage minimum, a fast solid state storage minimum, but I think at the absolute stripped down bare bones minimum, 128 gigabytes of internal memory. I would like a 512 model, a 1 terabyte model, maybe that's stretching it quite a bit, but games are going to get huge. So the third thing to consider, I said it was going to be hardware, and I thought hardware is not going to be as big a consideration as I think maybe some people might think it is. More and more often now, these AAA titles are coming out to every major console, including PC. So they're coming out for PC, they're coming out for PlayStation 5, they're coming out for Xbox Elite X. And what that means is there's vast mod ability of the game itself to run on less powerful hardware. If you game on PC, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You ramp down settings, you ramp down the target frame rate, you ramp down the complexity of the textures, you ramp down anti-aliasing, you ramp down the resolution, all these things to get it to run smoothly on your computer. Even with consoles, even right now with PlayStation 4 and current generation of consoles, there are more often in games settings to reduce quality to favor frame rate or vice versa. Reduce the frame rate in favor of quality. Do you want to run a games really pretty at 30 frames per second, or do you want to run games less pretty but really fast at 60 frames per second, which is console plebeian, unless it's for whatever. You get what I'm saying. You can adjust certain things now. They're very adaptable to whatever platform that they're on. So I don't think Nintendo's hardest issue here is going to be the limited hardware of the Nintendo Switch. It's going to be the internet connection and the storage. So for games like The Witcher, when it comes to Nintendo Switch, it is, and Doom and whatever else, it's reduced in quality. First of all, it's going down from, you can scale it all the way up to 4K if you want on your PC. Vice versa, for porting to Nintendo Switch, it scales all the way down to 720p to make it work. I don't think that's going to be any different in the future, because even if a game comes out for PlayStation 5, even if the same game comes out on Xbox Elite X, it's going to be on PC, and the PC port definitely, more than any of the others, is going to be very scalable, very adjustable in its settings to make it run more comfortably on the wide variety of strength of PCs that are out there. So if they are that adaptable, they will be that adaptable to port to the Nintendo Switch. I don't think horsepower is going to be the issue. I think Switch owners know, and they expect that, no, you can't ramp everything up to 4K, and you can't have super sampling, anti-aliasing. You can't have every setting set to very high or ultra. You know that for portability, for the sake of the system hardware and the Switch and portability, that you're going to have to reduce those settings. And I don't think that's going to be any different in the near future. The last final thought here is that historically, and this is the biggest thing here, Nintendo has never considered what other companies are doing with their consoles. The Wii was 480p, something like that. With the Nintendo, oh, it's down there, you can't see it. Nintendo has never been about how good things look and how beefy their hardware is. They've always just been about their own games and running their own games and doing their own thing and experimenting with their own thing. So you have duds like the Virtual Boy, to a lesser extent the Wii U, and then you have smash hits like the Game Boy, the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, kind of lesser degree, but still a smash hit. The Switch is a phenomenon, and that's just because Nintendo, they have so much money stored up in the bank, they don't have to worry about flops and failures. So they've never gone completely with the mainstream to keep up with Microsoft and keep up with Sony. They've never done that, and they're not going to do that anytime in the near future. They're going to do their own thing. They're going to port whatever games they want over to the Switch, regardless of what we think here. That's just the way Nintendo's been since well, technically they started in the late 1800s, but since the NES came out, Nintendo has always just been off on their own, doing their own thing. So either way, it's not like the Switch is going to get sucky when the PS5 comes out and the Xbox Elite X comes out. It's only going to get better and better. But we love and hate Nintendo for that, for doing their own thing. We would like a lot more ports to come to the Switch. It's just not going to happen, period, regardless of where we are in generation and who's coming out with what hardware. It's just not going to happen. So I think that's going to do it for this podcast. I'll start wrapping up here. I forgot to say this at the beginning. I usually try to say this stuff at the beginning, but remember that we're all geeks about something. So embrace your inner geek and know that you are loved. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of being loved. You are worthy of giving love. And most importantly, you are worthy of your own self-respect. And I know that's a lot harder, easier said than done. But if we just try every day to kind of chip away at what's holding us back in terms of our own self-respect, if we start learning to chip away at loving ourselves, I think the world would be a better place. It's easier to love other people than it is to love ourselves. That's just the truth. So just know that you're worthy of love, and it's okay to be a geek about something. That means you're passionate and you're driven about something. We should all be so lucky to be geeks about something. So find your inner geek, embrace it, whether it's an old hobby or a new hobby. Maybe you can find something new by listening or watching Geek Therapy Radio. That's the goal of this channel. That's the goal of this podcast, is to help you connect with your inner geek and know that you are loved. So until tomorrow for the podcast, I don't know when I'll upload another podcast to YouTube, but in the near future. But until tomorrow on the podcast, I'll see you then.